Today's webinar is a special Arrival City event in the City Builder Book Club series co-hosted with Centre for City Ecology on the topic Tower Renewal in the Arrival City. So in cities around the world, high-density apartment tower neighborhoods are arrival cities to millions of urban migrants and their families. They're home to some of the most vibrant, ambitious, and often most vulnerable low-income populations in the city. So newcomers' success depends on access to the proper amenities, to social services, to public transport, and to local commercial and employment opportunities. So how can city planning leverage the social and economic potential of these dynamic, high-density neighborhoods for newcomers that so many newcomers call home? Today we've invited Graeme Stewart, one of the key initiators of the groundbreaking Tower Neighbourhood Renewal project in Toronto, to talk about new approaches to urban planning and neighbourhood revitalization, lessons learned from European cities, and how the Tower Renewal project integrates social resiliency, stewardship, and adaptability into its vision of city building. And from Rotterdam, the Netherlands, we're delighted to welcome Gerben Helleman as our guest interviewer. Gerben is an urban geographer who focuses on urban neighborhood regeneration and issues of social resilience and livability in and around residential housing complexes. He's also the blogger of Urban Springtime, a fantastic blog about the interface and connections between the planned and the lived city. So let me now introduce our guest speaker. Graeme Stewart is a Toronto-based architect and planner. He is an associate at ERA Architects and a founding director of the Centre for Urban Growth and Renewal. Graeme has been involved in numerous urban design, conservation, community building, and architecture initiatives with particular focus on neighborhood design and regional sustainability. Graeme is a key initiator of Toronto's Tower Renewal project and its plans for the future of Toronto's remarkable stock of modern tower neighborhoods. Not least of Tower Renewal's success is its partnerships it's forged with the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, the University of Toronto, various NGOs, including the United Way, and other partners. It's no surprise that in 2010, Graeme was recipient of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's National Urban Design Award for his ongoing research and design work related to Tower Renewal. And again in 2014, Graeme was awarded the Jane Jacobs Prize. So welcome, Graeme. We're delighted to have you joining us. The podium is yours.
Well, thanks so much for having me. To start off, when I was asked to do this, the notion of an Arrival City book club sounded just fantastic. And Doug Saunders has been a collaborator in this. And since the book came out, it was sort of midstream when we were beginning to move forward with some of these ideas, and it so clearly articulated the power of arrival cities and the potential that they can have in the future of our cities. And so this is a great pairing, so we're very, very happy to be here. So what I'm going to do now is go through a presentation for about 20 minutes that's going to outline some of the key research and some of the key initiatives that we're working on with Tower Renewal. Tower Renewal began a little under 10 years ago, a lot of it as simply research that I was doing as a grad student, was able to get some bursaries and travel scholarships to look at what was happening elsewhere, and then it was able to emerge incrementally as a series of planned initiatives working with the city and the other people that you just mentioned. So it's been a wonderful process of collaboration. The focus of this work is what you see in this first image here, and it's these concrete slab buildings that are ubiquitous across the world. There was a period of enormous growth between 1950 to the late 70s that was global in nature, affected every country, and every country sort of adapted this type of housing in a different way. What's interesting about the Toronto context and the Canadian context is that we actually have a significant amount of this particular type of housing. Toronto, with the research we've done, is in fact one of the leaders in the world for just the sheer volume of tower slabs that we have. And what's interesting also is that they're so it's different than the patterns of growth in the United States. It's very unusual to find suburbanized high-rise housing in the United States. Most American suburbs are very low-rise, where in the Toronto and sort of Ontario condition, it's completely ubiquitous. So the photo that you see here is taken in a Toronto suburb called Etobicoke, but it could be anywhere in the vast region. And so a lot of the work that I did and have then built sort of a large group of colleagues who are researching this and working with this is, what does this mean for the potential and the identity of Toronto? One piece of information that might be interesting for our international guests is that Toronto's identity is, for a long time, was largely related to sort of Victoriana, about these sort of central city neighborhoods, streetcar neighborhoods that were low-rise, and a lot of the emotional heart of the city was about that type of built form. And there was a great reform movement in the 1970s that kind of rejected modernism and said that cities should be built on this type of fabric, and how do we work with work with what we have and really embrace these sort of older parts of the city. What's interesting is when that happened, there became a real negative dialogue about the sort of modern era of growth in the city, which I'm going to outline here. And one of the issues is we became a little bit blindsided, or there was a bit of what I described as cultural amnesia, where for a period of several decades, we didn't take into account the radical and very interesting changes that were happening in our modern neighborhoods, or we weren't considering what are potential opportunities and solutions related to them. It was more, they were a mistake, let's do something different. So Tower Renewal is saying, 50 years later after these buildings were built, how do we look at them more objectively and put them in the center of a conversation about how the city can grow as a more sustainable, equitable, and healthy place? And so all the phenomenal work that's been done in the last 20 years of really rethinking how cities can grow and become the center of national discussions about sustainability and the economy and all these amazing things. How do we put these buildings, these sort of relics from another time period, in the center of that conversation? And then the work and the research has really found that it's imperative that we do that for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into. It's also very much about communities and a ground-up opportunity. These are a big piece of context is that these buildings in Toronto are vast majority privately developed, privately developed and currently privately owned, whereas in most European contexts and certainly in the U.S., these buildings are social housing or public housing. So it's a very different context. About 10% of these buildings in Toronto are public housing, the rest are private. But the communities in them are very fluid and very dynamic, and today often are the arrival cities. So there's a huge grassroots opportunity and initiatives. The second piece is more of a top-down planning piece. What are the policy regimes that could be reconsidered? What are the financial instruments? What are these system-based approaches that could actually enable positive change in these places? So it's that sort of binary between ground up and top down that is the opportunity and challenge of this, especially in the context of a private dominated housing system. So for a little context, these are the buildings that we're looking at. And for years, people sort of had a very uncomfortable relationship with them. And part of this is a cultural project to begin to change that. This photo is actually part of a photographic series that a colleague of mine has done, who's now based in LA, which is looking at these buildings and photographing them with sort of the heroic intent in which they were originally designed. And what's sometimes difficult for people to remember is that these buildings were very much loved and very much thought of as a progressive and good thing at the time of their construction. And so part of it, our office is actually a heritage firm where the bulk of our work is working with older buildings, rehabilitating them and helping to show their value. And we strongly believe that these buildings do have value. And how do there's sort of a nice quote that a colleague of mine likes to say, is that you can only help something if you love it. And so to have an attitude that these buildings are scary and awful and need to be fixed isn't the right one. It's like, how do we understand where they came from, what their positive pieces are, and how can we go from there? So that's very much the frame in which I'm going to be discussing this. This is a photograph of Toronto, sort of taken from an airplane coming in. And what's really unique about Toronto is that in spite of this sort of romantic vision of ourselves as a sort of low-rise, street-oriented city, what distinguishes us in North America is, in fact, we're a high-rise city, and we're actually a suburbanized high-rise city. So what's interesting about this photo isn't the downtown. Other cities like Chicago have much more robust downtowns. It's the background of these sort of 20-story slabs that you see going throughout the suburbs. And so a lot of this was just beginning to catalog and understand where do they come from, how many are there, how do they fit into the housing system. We did a large study for the province of Ontario, and we're shocked to find that there's more than 2,000 of these buildings in the greater region, which are conservatively home to 1 million people. 1,200 of these buildings are in the city of Toronto itself. So it's a volume of housing which is of national significance. It's not sort of a local curiosity. This is a big deal. This is some mapping that we did within the city of Toronto, showing the distribution of these towers. So the red blob at the bottom is downtown by Lake Ontario, and the white dots are where these buildings are. And what's very interesting, and it's sort of more European in its morphology as opposed to North American, is that it's more of a carpet of high-rise housing throughout the region, almost equally distributed, where the typical North American city is high density in the center and increasingly low density as you move out. Surprisingly, some of the most high-dense neighborhoods and the largest concentrations of rental housing are as much as 20 or 30 kilometers away from downtown. This is looking at that in the regional context. So Toronto is the central city that you see, and then this is the larger region. And we were also surprised to find that these buildings are spread out, these 2,000 buildings, in the larger region. So this is very much a regional issue, which is why we can get partners like the province involved. So looking sort of historically, this is probably one of my favorite slides of the presentation. This is Toronto in 1954. So you can see that the built boundary of the city was quite small at that time as compared to the last slide. Most of what at that time was the metropolitan Toronto, which was formed in 1954, which is a grouping of smaller cities that created sort of a planning network, was farmland. And so there was this notion of that they were going to start planning and building the city when half of it wasn't built yet. So they were able to use some sort of forward-thinking ideas to do that. The next thing that happened in 1954 is the first leg of the subway was built. So you can see that little white line was the small first leg of the subway. And also the red dot is a neighborhood called Don Mills, which was the first in North America to rethink suburbia. Already in 1954, there was this discussion of like uncontrolled sprawl and too many cars and the whole bit. And so Don Mills was a very unique neighborhood that combined living, working, and shopping in an integrated and master planned way. It also included a whole lot of mid-rise apartments. And it ushered in an era where the next phase said, we're going to do this, but we're going to add high-rise apartments. And so while a lot of the sort of psychology about what the suburbs represent in North America and Toronto are images like this, sort of never-ending fields of bungalows, this is what was being planned in Toronto at the same time, these sort of apartment cities. And the idea, very much based on the New Towns Act and similar thinking in London, in fact, a lot of London planners and architects were involved, was this idea of these satellite distributed communities that would be fully functional and be high-rise outside of the city center. And part of the notion of building high-rise was they wanted to keep people within that boundary, within that white line of Metro Toronto, but also wanted to provide the kind of suburban amenity of open space and light and green space and all those sort of, wonderful post-war ideas. So we had a very interesting sort of hybrid situation happen in Toronto where a lot of European ideas, and again, this is because a lot of European planners came in and made their livelihoods in Toronto, and you can't underemphasize the connection to the UK and Canada at that time. We were still that was a large part of where these ideas came from. You can see here the Manual of English Housing from 1946, and then a photograph of Toronto in the late 1950s, where farmers' fields are turned into modern towers. And it's also sort of important the idea that these really went from farmers' fields to the future sort of in one step. There wasn't sort of anything in between. The planning context really was quite rigorous. There were private developers who took the initiative and built these sort of remarkable satellite cities, but there was a lot of public policy and public direction that said they'd be integrated with schools, they'd be integrated with transportation, they'd be integrated with community centers. The big difference is in terms of our thinking today, even though the bullet points on the plan documents are the same about these mixed communities, it was all sort of conceived of at the scale of the car. So everything would be a 5-minute drive away or a 3-minute drive away for convenience. Very different today when we think of walkability, but albeit considered as planned neighborhoods. So the suburbs of Toronto are kind of remarkable in the fact that they were very much planned through modern conception, and the volume of housing is absolutely enormous. So this is a chart looking at multiple apartment housing, the red being apartment housing, the blue is single-family homes. And if you look between 1960 and 1980, during that boom, it was a complete inverse of what most people tend to think about the growth of Toronto. Very few single-family homes, vast majority were apartments. There's a remarkable condominium boom happening today in Toronto, mostly downtown, but the apartment boom from 50 years ago is still larger, and it represents 50% of all rental housing in the greater region. If you look at some of the original advertisements, they talked about all the great amenities these neighborhoods would have and how forward-thinking they were. This is an advertisement, a gentleman in his grand piano. You can see some of the advertisements from the brochures that look very much like the condo ads today, except for extremely dated gender roles. But this idea that these were considered to be chic, they were considered to be progressive, it was sort of, Canada emerging as a modern country, sort of, the Jetsons had arrived. Very different than sort of the perception we have of these buildings today. And this is the result of these sort of master plan communities. I mean, this is a neighborhood in a suburb called North York, but it could, this looks like a landscape from the Soviet Union. You can see how they relate to arterials and large car areas, as well as to natural systems. This is another great photograph where you can see that sort of deer in the foreground. And the results of this, so here on the left we can see the edge of that built boundary where it was about building high-rise right to the edge and then keeping a green belt beyond. Unfortunately, that green belt was eroded in the 1980s, but there really was an intent to keep it. But what it means is that we have a completely different regional morphology than other North American cities. So on the right, we see Toronto on top and Chicago down below. The red is where high-rise apartments are located. So in Chicago, it's all along Lake Michigan, which is impressive and amazing. But if you go 20 kilometers inland in Chicago, you're in sort of Atlanta-style sprawl, where in Toronto, you're hitting one of these sort of remarkable high-rise hotspots. So what surprisingly, it means that the greater Toronto region actually has double the density of the greater Chicago region, which puts us in a much better position in terms of thinking of sustainable planning, transport networks, and growth towards the future. Also surprisingly, sort of internationally, we kind of punch above our weight in terms of just the sheer number of high-rises. This is looking at buildings 12 stories and above. So we're number 2 in North America by quite a large margin. And surprisingly, Canadian cities are also sort of like Edmonton has more high-rise buildings than Boston, which seems quite surprising. But it's because most of these were the residential forms that you didn't quite see as much of in the U.S. On the other side, we see global rankings. I don't believe these. The Chinese numbers are obviously wrong, but this is what was available through the data set. But growing liability. So it came with from a very ambitious and progressive set of ideas, and then during that 30-year period, which I described previously, of sort of shifting attitudes and neglect, these buildings are in a very different position in the housing market. It went from very much mid-range housing to now being the most affordable private housing available. What the city has also changed, where there's increased polarization, where the center of Toronto is becoming increasingly wealthy, and the dark gray areas in this map, where most of these towers are, and also where there aren't rapid transit lines, is where poverty is increasing and where these buildings are located. An unintended sort of consequence is when these buildings were built, it was presumed everyone would own a car, and they put shrink wrap zoning on these neighborhoods that sort of said anything, what was built is what was allowed, so they're strictly residential in use, which puts a lot of limitations on how they could evolve. And as we know, and really the core of the story is that they have become the arrival cities. As Toronto emerged in the 1970s as this amazing place for the world to come, these buildings were kind of on offer as available and affordable. But while we've had this remarkable shift in demographics over the last 30 years, the character of the populations in these neighborhoods have changed. The physical aspects of these neighborhoods have remained almost identical. So there's a complete strangeness in how little they've changed physically, except for incrementally getting worse. And if you look at the photo at the bottom with the chain link fence, a lot of the kind of planned natural areas and planned open spaces have been compromised by, one owner sells his building and they put up a fence so that there's no one gets sued for trespassing. So really a lot of challenges have emerged. Another set of challenges is that some of the pieces that would really enable arrival cities to thrive, such as childcare, language services, job opportunities, et cetera, things that are offered in the city of Toronto but not offered on these sites locally, are seen as not were never conceived of as on these places. And so you find these total dead zones when thousands of people live in these buildings and they have to do everything that you would do in a city off-site. And then sort of to add insult to injury, these buildings are also very wasteful in terms of their energy intensity. They were built before conservation was an issue, so single glazed windows, et cetera, no insulation, and they're among the most carbon-intensive buildings in the city. So part of a side stream of research is about how to retrofit them. So enter Tower Renewal. So into this notion of if we do the research and it sounds completely overwhelming and sort of the negativity, the flip side is that through a host of engagements, a host of interviews, a host of working with communities, the vast majority of people that live in these buildings like their neighbors, like their flats, and feel that they're invested in where they live, and they know that there's huge rooms for improvement, but they're not saying, get me out of here. They're saying, how can we make our neighborhoods better, which is an enormously fantastic finding in the idea that these places can be resilient and sustainable. The other piece is that they have a host of larger apartment suites. They were built for 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, sometimes even 4 bedrooms. So they've been able to accommodate large and multi-generational families, and in sort of, or have been in a way that was not anticipated, be resilient in terms of bringing in new populations. And so the opportunity and the optimism of Tower Renewal is, how do we take advantage of all of the opportunities by allowing these places to evolve with the needs and aspirations of their residents. So over the last 6 years or so, we've done a host of studies with a variety of partners. We've pushed through policy changes. We've worked on pilot projects. And I've also been lucky enough to tick off a lot of these boxes and do some extensive travel research throughout the EU and Russia. And the interesting thing is, as Gerben knows well, that most European cities are similar in their form, and that a lot of the high-rise housing is suburbanized. And we looked through this lens. This is a public health, Toronto Public Health is a partner in this, and we looked through the lens of this, including natural environment, transportation, housing, food security, health services, et cetera, about how we can improve these neighborhoods through that criteria. So, we were, through the research and looking at the different partners, very heartened to see that there's a host of examples throughout Europe about we can almost cherry pick the best ideas in terms of what makes sense for Toronto. So this is East Berlin, sort of a former, you could imagine, a gray Soviet wasteland. Now, because of liberalization, there's the ability to have vibrant marketplaces, retrofitted buildings. And the lesson from this is the buildings aren't the problem, because there's a host of people that say, demolish these buildings, they're terrible. The issue is the systems around the buildings are the problem, in terms of allowing for economies to evolve, allowing for people to engage, and allowing for it to act as a neighborhood, the type of neighborhood that Jane Jacobs would suggest, eyes on the street and the whole bit, can emerge in these under certain circumstances. Other simple things, by putting a couple chairs on the ground and allowing a restaurant on the ground floor, completely changes the dynamic of how these buildings can operate. So they're flexible and they can evolve. Some other types of more ambitious projects. This is in London, where the retrofit of 5 towers was enabled through mixed development of new condominiums and some affordable units, helped to cross-subsidize new community facilities near a new tube station. This is some other solar walls and some other ways to retrofit buildings. Another example of how these look. This is in Sweden, and in this case in Sweden, quite a charming little piece. They enclosed the ground floor that used to be open, put in a winter garden, and this is where the laundry room is. They've also reduced 70% of all of energy loads through enclosing balconies and other types of things. And then from the urban design perspective, so this is in Holland. I'm sure you've probably been here, Gerben. This is a neighborhood in Amsterdam. Connecting these neighborhoods through bicycle networks, connecting these neighborhoods through connective infrastructures. And this, you can't really tell, but there's a grocery store on the ground floor of this set of flats. Putting community services right where they're needed. Toronto has a great host of libraries and community services. They're just often in awkward places, especially in the suburbs. By putting them right at the base of buildings, you can get that synergy. Looking at new housing, potentially family-appropriate housing on the base of these buildings. This is in the UK. This is another example in the UK where much more ambitious scale of housing is helping to cross-subsidize the retrofit of the building and add new ownership opportunities for some of the residents. And then somewhat these modified flats could look like. This is in a neighborhood in Berlin with triple glazed windows and low energy units in the whole bit. And what's really core to the discussion that we're having today is about programming and some simple things, as much as putting a community kitchen in the base of a building, allowing for tenant associations, allowing for just people to meet and do their thing. It's amazing how little space is available in these towers with 1,000 people. As soon as that goes in there, the spin-off effects are remarkable. A lot of this is around food and marketplaces, things, again, that most neighborhoods take for granted, and the results are pretty spectacular. This is one example that shows the power of putting infrastructure in. This is in Sweden, where they put in a subway, and suddenly you actually have public space and meeting spaces. This is an example of that park in London again. And unfortunately, this is the condition that we're dealing with in Toronto, where you've got these large towers, lots of open space, and things like closed down pools and chain link fences. So lots of opportunity, but a long way to go. The other trick is that coming back and realizing the simple things like let's put up a fruit stand in some of these neighborhoods where there's an interested community, there's an interested counselor, there's an interested group of people, most of that until very recently was considered to be illegal or at least non-conforming to zoning. We did that large study for public health where we came up with 36 strategies that could be very modest things to improve health and economic outcomes in these neighborhoods. The vast majority were presented by either official plan rules or zoning bylaw rules, so very hamstrung by policy. Not because anyone wanted them not to be there, but just because they'd never been revisited and they'd never been reconsidered. And why this is important is this is a diabetes map of the City of Toronto. The darker the shade of red, the higher the incidence of diabetes, and you can see where the towers are located. So this lack of the ability to provide local services and fresh food, et cetera, is making our citizens less healthy. So this is a crucial issue. So luckily, we were able to take this evidence and work with our partners to go to the City of Toronto and lobby for major changes to zoning. And so the idea that you can see how can parking lots become pop-ups, et cetera, we were able to create what's called the residential apartment commercial zone. You can see here where previously, no, you can't have a bank, you can't have a coffee shop, you can't have all these things. Now those things are available as of right. And this summer, it'll finally, after a lot of bureaucracy, go live, and these things will be able to happen in over 500 sites throughout the city, which you can see in this map, which we're extremely excited about. In the meantime, and getting ready for that, we've been working with a host of partners, including United Way Toronto and other neighborhood groups to do, and even the National Film Board of Canada, to do a series of workshops that have been going on with residents for years, and really working to vision neighborhoods, and especially working with youth. There's this remarkable neighborhood called the East Scarborough Storefront that has some fantastic things that are lessons for the rest of the city, but how you engage the youth of a neighborhood to help reimagine it. And what's amazing is the things that are coming out of the mouths of the kids that live in these neighborhoods are very similar to the things that the quote-unquote experts are saying are required. So gathering spaces, convenient access to food, shops and daycare, gardens, community programs, connections, really simple things that are currently lacking in these spaces. And so through a process of visiting and getting sort of consensus around some of the changes that can happen, we've been able to work with the city and other partners to do some demonstrations and pop-ups of these pieces to align sort of grants and other opportunities to see some of these changes, and then scale it up to larger programs where the United Way has created an actual division in their very large organization dedicated to Tower Neighbourhood Renewal, connecting them with donors for fundraising and to be able to deliver programs and neighborhood improvements. This is an example of sort of a scaled-up version of consultation where a neighborhood counselor is meeting with a very large group. People are going to different tables to figure out how they can volunteer and be part of different things, and how these have spun off into a variety of small-scale successes. My favorite of this is in the top left. This is by something called Food Share in Toronto Public Health, where they've taken a bus and they've turned it into a mobile pop-up market where they can drive into different neighborhoods, put up their tent, and suddenly you've got a marketplace with affordable fresh food. What's remarkable is that prior to the zoning changes, they weren't allowed to go into the apartment sites to do this because you couldn't have commercial exchanges. That's going to change, which could hopefully mean that a fleet of these can go around the city. And that's just a small example of the types of sort of very grassroots changes. Another example is communities designing major changes. So this is a pavilion that was built. The community sort of co-designed and co-built. This is it sort of launching last year. So these are things we're quite excited about. This is another neighborhood where a park has been transformed into a community market, again breaking all sorts of bylaws, but in a way spearheading the changes that we could see go viral across the city. And this is an expansion to a community center sort of right where the buildings are that's underway that sort of echoes some of the things we saw in Europe. But on the other side, so that's sort of the grassroots, allowing for the bottom to percolate into the community to take control of their neighborhoods. On the other side is continuing to work with the province and the city to say what other types of zoning and bylaw changes or incentives or other things can we do for more comprehensive things, like bringing in rapid transit. This grouping of towers you can see has a huge amount of open space that could be reconsidered, where you can see the trees is where the chain link fences are, and there's a whole host of issues about how difficult it would be to make some substantive changes. So we're currently working with a group called Evergreen CityWorks, which is a remarkable outfit, to work with the city and a series of owners to do the financial analysis around how could this happen in the context of these being private buildings. How do we incent the owners to make the positive changes? How do we make it as easy as possible? So some of the pieces that we'd be looking at is how do you connect properties? How do you put pathways through properties? How would you add amenity and housing to cross-subsidize the retrofits that may be required. And sort of the simple way of looking at that is this is the present condition, probably about 2,000 people living in these towers. How do you allow for the small-scale pieces that are really going to contribute to agency and quality of life, and then scale that up with new housing options, new transit options, major connections, and major new facilities to be able to get this type of thing, get people on the ground, turn these into the dynamic neighborhoods that they are, and bring really focusing on these areas as the future of the city, and from a wide neighborhood context, looking at all the different facilities that could go there. And then from a macro context, looking how does this relate by connecting different neighborhoods, connecting to ecological systems, getting partners like the Conservation Authority, which controls kind of the watershed of the region, who's a partner, and think of this at a grand scale. So it goes from the very minute to the very large quite quickly, and it certainly is an ambitious project that we think has hopefully will be kicking along for the next 20, 30 years. But that in a nutshell is the ambitions behind the project. And of course, this is the reason that we're doing it, because we've invited the world to our city. We need to make sure that we do them justice, and that there's the dream that they had about coming to this place does come true, and they're not disappointed as several people currently are. And that is Tower Neighbourhood Renewal. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Graeme. Graeme, thank you. That vision was wonderful, and now we're going to turn it over to Gerben Helleman.
Yes. Hi, Graeme. Thanks a lot for this clear presentation. I've already read a lot of things about the Tower Renewal program, and I think this presentation sums this up very well. It's a great summary. To be honest, I'm very impressed by your commitment and effort to put this enormous task on the political agenda. And just as you said, you have high ambitions, and I think very interesting ideas to give these buildings and these neighborhoods a second life. Before I come to my questions, let me say a few words about the things that stand out for me from a European perspective and from my experience. On the one hand, I see many similarities, just as you told me, with high-rise estates in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in Paris. For example, the separations of functions, the lack of good connections with the inner city, and especially the way the public space is designed and used, or we should probably say unused or underused, because in most countries nobody is willing to take responsibilities for these large public green spaces. And also very recognizable are the issues of poverty, language disadvantages, and education. On the other hand, there are also some unique situations in Toronto, taking for example the amount of high-rise estates, being the second largest concentration of high-rise buildings in North America, as you mentioned. And of course, a big difference is the ownership. As you told us, the buildings in Toronto are mostly privately owned. In Europe, they are mostly from the public sector. So I can imagine in Toronto it's probably a very difficult challenge to get all the parties, the stakeholders with their own interests together and trying to make public-private partnerships and coalitions. So my first question is really about that. How are you or the city trying to convince the property owners to take any action? And is it possible, or can you seduce them with a profitable business plan?
Indeed. So that is the piece of work that we're really focused on right now. And so as you mentioned, it's remarkably complex. What we've had to do with this is there's a lofty ambition, clearly, but also in a sort of pragmatic sense. What is the most urgent piece, and how do we move forward with doing what can be done now? The trick also is, when I say we, I'm referring to my immediate colleagues, sort of at ERA Architects in the Center for Urban Growth and Renewal, and we're architects. We're architects and planners. We work in private practice. We do it in collaboration with universities and other people, but we don't own these buildings. We don't write policy. We're not the authorities. We're not the city or the province. And so part of it was, how do we begin to institutionalize some of these ideas? So the first step was a few years ago, presenting this research in a convincing way to get it involved in the city. So that meant collaborating with the then mayor, David Miller, who was quite taken by some of the ideas of how this could be about health and equity, and established, working with us through a working group, established a Tower Renewal office in the city. And that was a major step to sort of get it into planning and make this sort of an official piece. We really realized that there was two options. One, find a willing owner and do a really great project, or two, institutionalize it and make it something that could continue to grow from there. If we did a one-off but it wasn't repeatable, there wasn't much of a point. So that was the track that we took. The second piece, and this is sort of bringing in the other NGOs like Toronto Public Health, well, I guess it's a government, so it's not quite an NGO, but Toronto Public Health and United Way and other groups. And so it's been this sort of really interesting, what I describe as a constellation of efforts where people have said, this aligns with my values and my mandate, so we're going to sort of work in parallel. And there's been great conversations between these groups and the city and their agendas. So when I sort of describe what was first of all, the most present and immediate issue, it was the quality of life in these spaces. So while this started primarily as an energy program, when I say we now, I mean the city and us, began doing consultations with residents, we realized there aren't tenant associations. There's nobody responsible to sort of say, I'm the cheerleader and I can speak for this building. A lot of the cases I'm familiar with in Europe, there's far more sort of organization on the tenant side. So part of it is really starting from ground zero and saying, well, we need to work with partners to even begin to create groups that can organize and establish a vision to be able to even have an appropriate conversation about changes that can happen. So that's a process that's actually taken several years, and the city has taken it on full steam through their social development office, and they've got a lot of staff members sort of working on that. So that's sort of stream one. This is a very long-winded way to answer your question. So the second point is the city then and the province and some of the utilities like the gas utilities and the electricity utilities began putting programs together that in the short term would make sense and encourage owners to begin to cut their energy. And so that's been relatively successful, and we sort of call that the low-hanging fruit. And so for relatively modest but impactful retrofits such as light changes, toilet changes, sealing windows, cutting energy, getting more high-efficient boilers. There's been quite a large uptake across the apartment sector in doing that. The next step, which is your question, is the order of magnitude of investment to A, turn the building into a high-efficiency building, and B, provide the social community and sort of economic infrastructure in these neighborhoods is in the order of magnitude of several $1 million. Well, not several, probably more, like 10 to 15 per cluster of towers. So what we're doing now is the studies in consultation with a series of owners. We have the group of the largest owners in the city as well as some smaller ones for a different perspective, and looking at what are the barriers for them to do this with the ambition, and we're doing this working with the Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs at the province to say how can some policies be tweaked so that things would be, so private actors would be encouraged to do these, but at the same time, what are the business practice changes or even the regulation changes that would be needed to encourage people to make these types of investments?
Yeah. Well, a lot of new questions come to my mind, but let's move on. The other question is in line with what you told me just now. The second question is more about the looking on the community involvement. Of course, the most important partner in neighborhoods are the current residents. Can you tell us a little bit more in what kind of way they are involved, and do they have a voice in the plans? And secondly, what is, according to them, the most urgent, the most important thing that should be done? Because you started it with a study for energy-saving measurements, and the focus was initially and primarily on environmental things. But how does that cope with the current residents? Do they also want to focus on that, or do they have some completely different needs, like better transit, employment, schools, or something completely else?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting is we always viewed this as a full package, the idea that these neighborhoods could evolve in many ways, and that for myself as a architect, planner, and urban designer, it was always sort of the urban potential of these places that I found most captivating. But of course, the building upgrades and energy upgrades was a big part of that. What's interesting is sort of like the trends in fashion and policy, because in a certain sense, when we first presented this full package of opportunities, everybody sort of picked out the environmental piece because it was sort of in the air at the time, and this was sort of 2008-ish. That's since been completely inverse, where right now energy is probably the bottom of the list and economic issues are the top of the list for obvious reasons.
Okay.
But sort of in that sort of menu of things, the way that the residents have been involved is because the best uptake that we've had so far with the project really relates to the topic of conversation we're having today, which is around the arrival city, around the urgent needs of newcomers coming to this. And what's kind of heartening and interesting is that providing some of those infrastructures is actually at a significantly reduced cost than the major retrofit of a building. And so working with the partners that we brought on board, and now we're taking this in their own directions, which is fantastic, like United Way, et cetera, and a host of other groups. There's been a huge amount of engagement with communities, and where it's been most successful is where there's already a community partner stationed in the neighborhood. So there's a neighborhood called Thorncliffe Park, and they have a Thorncliffe neighborhood office that pre-existed any of this, and they've been able to scale up and become real champions with funding from groups like United Way and others to be able to provide language training, provide job training, to provide integration services, and do these things. And Toronto's one of the amazing things about Toronto is that there's so many of these organizations exist. It's sort of a process of connecting the dots, of making sure that the towers became a real center of the conversation about service delivery. And I'd say that's one of the things that we're probably most proud of in the short-term successes of the last few years, is just bringing towers to the center of that conversation and taking the existing resources that are around and deploying them and scaling up. So there are some neighborhoods that have been, there's work to do, but there's a real sense of engagement and with residents. Where it's a real challenge is where those institutions don't exist, where the geography of the towers is displaced, so you don't have a grouping of 10 towers together that can sort of coalesce, but they're scattered a little bit, and so where people are isolated and those institutions don't exist. So that is where it is a challenge. In terms of residents' wishes, I went through it a little bit in the presentation, but it's this real mixture of people liking where they live, but knowing that things can be better. And I think that tension is what is key to any sort of successful urban endeavor.
Okay. Well, I also asked this question about the resident involvement because most of the time different people see things differently, and residents, professionals, politicians, policymakers, they all have their own opinion mostly about these neighborhoods. So you just mentioned Thorncliffe Park is one of the high-rise estates that's also part of the Tower Renewal program. Doug Saunders also writes in his book Arrival City is about Thorncliffe Park, and in his opinion it's a very popular place with, and I quote, vacancy rates close to zero and with a lot of migrants who are entering the middle-class urban mainstream within a generation, end of quote. And he also says that the neighborhood seems to benefit from its tight cluster of poor, rural, foreign residents because this helps its function as an instrument of integration, a platform of urban inclusion, etc., etc. But I also read that City Council, on the other hand, has indicated Thorncliffe Park as one of the neighborhood improvement areas where interventions are necessary and one should, for example, fight urban poverty. So for me that sounds a little bit as opposing views. So I was wondering, what is your opinion? In your opinion, the long-term goal for these neighborhoods? Is the goal, for example, to make it an average neighborhood with less room for the current residents? Some people say gentrification, and the bad side of gentrification. Or do you think that the goal is more to reinforce the current identity of these neighborhoods? So maybe a very long question, but
that's a
what are your thoughts about this?
That's a fantastic question. I think it really comes to the core of the future of the city and the unique opportunity in Toronto. First off, I don't think those two things are as contradictory as they sound.
No.
Doug Saunders is looking at that Thorncliffe. If you ever visit Toronto, I really recommend you do visit it. It's absolutely remarkable. It was one of those neighborhoods I described that was very much planned and master planned to have a central park and a central school and a central shopping center, but sort of surrounded by a ring of high-rises. And so because of the geography of the neighborhood, it always did work fairly well, where some of the other neighborhoods that are more spatially separated, it seems that there might be physical interventions that could help create that sense of connection. In Thorncliffe, you wouldn't need any more buildings. There's enough buildings there. What is missing, though, and probably even between the time of his writing there's been some successes there, is some of the social infrastructure to buoy the fact that just by default, just because of the types of people that are coming, and the networks that they create, that they've created this amazing resiliency where that they've been able to thrive in their own way, but kind of despite the challenge of a lack of resources, a lack of outreach. And so when the city says it's one of the neighborhoods that could use more city resources in terms of language training, job training, libraries, whatever, that sort of host of things that cities and NGOs can do, so that it's more say let's put our resources where they're needed. This is also in the context where historically most of those types of resources went into urban neighborhoods, sort of downtown poor neighborhoods, and I think, as you know, Toronto's gone through a radical transformation where now our downtown is where the gentry lives and the suburbs are where services are needed. But in terms of your big question, which is the goal to normalize, quote unquote, Thorncliffe Park, or is it to increase the identity? I would say absolutely it's about enhancing the identity. What's remarkable about Toronto and these neighborhoods is that because of chain migration and other types of things, there's a really unique sort of cast of characters or communities in these places. So while they look the same, one would be very much a Russian neighborhood. Another one is Afghan mixed with Uzbek. Another one is so there's this idea where some are very mixed and some are very kind of almost in a way more monocultures of a certain group. But at the same time, if you took a sample of those neighborhoods every 10 years, the group would change because people are arriving and then they're moving on in some cases. So Thorncliffe Park is a very quick turnover neighborhood, where other neighborhoods are actually very slow turnover, where it's more endemic poverty. And I think that there needs to be a real careful calibration to where there's endemic poverty. There's this one set of solutions. In Thorncliffe Park, where people stay on average 5 to 10 years, the fact that there's, and Doug writes about this, the fact that it's high poverty is because people have just arrived. They don't have a lot of resources, but then they quickly gain resources and move someplace else. So as an urban geographer, I can totally understand why you're keen on this, and there needs to be a calibration. But I think in both cases, there's an argument to be made for better tools and better investments to make sure that we're making these work as arrival cities and not just assuming that they'll work as is.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot.
Another thing that's interesting, we did consultation for this new zoning changes all over the city, and people were very excited about this. And so it's kind of a no-brainer. It's like, can you start a small pop-up business in the parking lot? People are like, that's fantastic. So the goal is let's get some initiatives going and enable people to take advantage of these new tricks. We also found that in a lot of neighborhoods, people really resented the idea of being called an arrival city or being called an immigrant neighborhood. And it's because of the idea that some people have been there for 20 years. Some people have been there for 15 years. And so there's this notion of, no, I've been here. This is my neighborhood. I'm not new. And so there's a real subjectivity to what sort of like researchers would describe as newcomers versus local communities. And so I think there's also a very important local dynamic that needs to be obviously taken into consideration. And I think it was a wake-up call for the people in the room about the sort of way we describe these places as outsiders and what sort of interpreted as being offensive.
Yeah, absolutely true. That's why I always plea for more accuracy and precision in the analysis, etc. Kim,
Well,
take it over.
I'm going to jump in now and thank both of you, Graeme and Gerben, for this incredibly rich conversation we've had. It's very exciting to hear ideas like this being explored in such depth, and the potential they really do have to transform what some people think about as the urban fringe into something much more that is much more a story about community success. So I hope everybody in the audience that you've learned as much as we have from these fantastic ideas. We're going to now turn we've concluded the formal part of the presentation, so we're going to open the lines up for a few questions. We are pretty close to the hour. We're going to start with a question from Nazanin Sepenri, Separi Rad, who writes, what is the financial implication of the new RAC zoning? And specifically, what is the benefit to the building owner? So perhaps you could unpack that one for us.
Absolutely. So what's kind of remarkable about the new zoning is that it's very modest in that it allows for a very small amount of physical change to the neighborhood, but it allows a very ambitious amount of use changes. And so there's some potential changes to the ground floor, or there could be very small scale new buildings, but it also allows for almost an unlimited amount of things that could be done in the open space around the buildings, like pop-up markets or farmers markets and those types of things. So what it allows for is something that could be very much a very low investment required to engage in, and then something that would require more investment in the years moving forward. You could build an addition to the end of a building and program it with a restaurant or a community center or what have you. So the interesting piece is that this was advocated for by Toronto Public Health, ourselves, United Way. We brought this to City Council and kind of lobbied, and then our friends at the city were accepted this and then did an amazing job to rewrite the zoning, which was actually a lot of work. They had to rewrite the individual zoning on 500 sites, which took months and months of staff time. So kudos for the city for taking it on. The trick is that it has very little immediate economic benefit to the owners. So this isn't something that's this windfall for the owners. We did a lot of consultation with owners, and their attitude was like, well, it's up to me. So the issue is they own the property. They now have the right to engage in these things, but they're the gatekeepers, and still they own the property, so they can sort of say yes or no to anything. But the United Way and other groups have been doing some really good one-on-one consultation with property managers and owners. And the attitude is that in neighborhoods where things are happening, where residents really have a clear idea, where there's a neighborhood spokesperson from one of the community groups and said, this is what we want to do, the owners are really saying, you know what, as long as someone else looks after it, it doesn't cost me anything, someone's taking responsibility for it, it's going to probably reduce turnover, because if I'm in the building that has the mini grocery store or the farmer's market, that's going to be attractive. And it's going to, maybe reduce my vacancies. Like those are the ways they're thinking about it at this point. So it could be very much a community-led piece, and the idea is that we'll get some examples that are very community-led. And the owners are just sort of more like, well, all I have to do is say yes or no. So it's working with the owners who want to say yes, and there are several. That is the phase that it's at right now.
Fascinating. Of course, these are all investments in the city's tax base too, aren't they, with the high density we're talking about in these towers. So it's interesting to hear that you have developed such strong partnerships with agencies like the Toronto Public Health, that they're helping rewrite ideas about community investment. And that leads us to a question that we have here from Suzanne Vaughn. She'd like to know more about the recommendations that you showed to improve health in the neighborhood.
Yeah, if you'd like to look at our reports, if you go to, we could link this to your website, but it's called Toward Healthy Apartment Neighborhoods, and if you Google it, you'll be able to download the report. And we broke it into those 8 categories, some of which were about food access, health access, jobs and employment, training and education. And it was really simple stuff which led to the idea of this change in zoning. The simple way to put it is that the City of Toronto already has an amazing host of services, whether they're from the city itself or from partners. They were just restricted in delivering those services in these buildings. And so a simple one could be a public health nurse offering flu shots. believe it or not, that was prohibited under the zoning bylaw. Like, unbelievable. Like no one could believe this, right? And the owner's lawyers would just say, well, you technically can't do this, so we're going to say no. Now, public health can knock on the door of an owner or make an agreement with an owner who owns 50 buildings and say, we have a flu shot clinic program. Can we use your community room on Tuesday in November? And they can say yes. And then suddenly you have a key service delivered, which is about health outcomes. That's a very, very minor example. Other ones are doctors' offices can now be built on these sites. Pharmacies can be built on these sites. Those are more pure health delivery. But then the other ones are about transportation. Can we find ways to connect these buildings and make pedestrian and cycle routes so that people have more active transportation bases? And that's an ongoing thing. It's a really interesting legal question about how two opposing owners make an as of rights throughway agreement and not worry about getting sued. I mean, these are the challenge is if these were public buildings, none of this would be an issue. Because they're private buildings, they are. But then the flip side of it is because they're private buildings, this might sound a little crazy to say, but the research has shown that if you took the public buildings that we have like this and the private buildings are in better shape. They have a higher level of investment, so that there are some opportunities about them being privately owned.
Well, it's really fun, fantastic story of transformation that you're describing. I do have a question here from Melissa Routledge. She says, what plans are in place to determine what new uses will occur in the buildings? Will it be done on a building by building basis? And what framework will be in place for engaging Tower residents and the surrounding community?
Well, that's interesting. So that process has already been done. So the new zoning that's coming into effect this summer allows you, and you can. There's information we can provide about what the city determined were the appropriate uses. So how this worked is that we did the research and lobbied that new uses should be allowed, and then went through a very formal process with the city and their planners to determine what would be of an appropriate list of uses. And I think there's somewhere around 20 to 25 new uses that they're saying are now going to be allowed on these sites. So once they came up with a draft to say, these are the things we think work, there was an extensive consultation and process in partnership with United Way again, who was a key partner, done all over the city. And there was workshops in all sorts of different neighborhoods, and then there were formal process of consultation that went on for months. And a lot of the research that sort of advocated for these changes involved consultation itself. So it was a fairly thorough process. And so now the list of those 20 or so uses, which includes, food or health services or very small businesses like an accounting office or those types of things, they're just as of right allowed. And so all that's required then is either a building permit or a business permit or some very minor things, but the use will be allowed on those sites. If something more ambitious is proposed, so the uses are allowed, but in very small kind of quantities, that was sort of the control. So very, very small businesses, like 200 square meters max type of thing. But if something more ambitious was proposed, that would have to go through a formal community rezoning process and the whole bit.
Wow, that's fantastic. So I think we've got time for one more question. This one is from Helen Hanratty in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and she asks about how we convince people that improvement does not equate with gentrification, a term she notes angers many people. She says indeed may even frighten many people. So maybe we could have a last word on that sort of tension between improvement and gentrification.
Yeah, no, I mean there's a whole hour discussion there.
We don't have an hour.
Totally. There's a few points to this. So one of the core aspects of this project is how do we do this while maintaining this as the key affordable housing stock in the region. So everything that's been done to date has been with that in mind. And the city has some very tough rules about being able to keep rents where they are. And they often, if they allow for a development on a site, if they said we're going to allow for a new condo on some of the open space that can help cross-subsidize some improvements, they can actually make an agreement that the owners have to maintain rents at a certain level, at the same affordable level that they are now for a period of 10 to 20 years. So there's some very tough measures the city can do to maintain affordability. The other aspect to this is that these buildings right now are in a position for the last 30 years or so of sort of with sort of like unmanaged neglect. It's sort of like there's been nothing really done to them. They're just sort of existing. They're sort of gradually getting a little bit worse and worse and worse. And then you hit a point now where we firmly believe that unless calculated and community-based investments take place, that some of these buildings and some of these communities are at risk of either the housing not being tenable in the next 20 years or the communities getting into a really, really tough place that becomes, just something we don't want to do as a society. And so investments and improvements we really feel are required. So it becomes a sort of perennial challenge as people engage in cities. How do you make improvements without gentrifying the neighborhood? And so looking at the tools of agreements with owners about rents, other types of things, or just providing more affordable housing is top of mind. So there is no real answer. But the one thing to keep in mind is we're talking about 2,000 buildings. We're talking about an area that is almost the entire geography of the region. And the gentrification that's happened in Toronto in the last 15 years has been extraordinary, but geographically isolated to a large parts of downtown. So the issue is that we're talking about such a large part of the city that I don't think that there's a worry that suddenly all of these towers are just going to gentrify overnight. There's just simply not enough investment. There's not enough money for that to happen. So that's, but I think a discussion should and will continue about how improvements don't isolate the people that are trying to be the center of this conversation.
Wow, thank you so much. What an interesting conversation we've had here this morning. I really appreciate everything that you've shared with us, Graeme, and Gerben, for your wonderful animation of this conversation. We're at the end of our Q&A now, but before we close, I'd like to just ask you each one more question. To you, Graeme, what is the next big idea that's coming to you at Tower Renewal that you're focusing on over the next few months?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the question. I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, the trick with this is the work that I'm doing with an amazing group of partners is how can we work with people who are ready and available to do something that's achievable. And this is in the absence of this being a very top-down, government-led, and highly resourced project. It's not like we're dealing with these huge budgets and we can do all this stuff. So it's still very much how can we be nimble and make impact. So we're very pleased that the new mayor of the City of Toronto is a supporter of Tower Renewal. We're very pleased that the city has reorganized their Tower Renewal division to have more staff and be coordinated with the rest of the planning division. So there's some really good signs. But as Gerben mentioned, the core to this is how would we find a way for the private owners to be partners in this and to be able to leverage significant investments in a way that makes sense for them, but that doesn't displace the residents. And part of that is there an opportunity on some of these sites, maybe near subway stations or rapid transit, to be able to invest in new housing and new other developments that can help cross-subsidize improvements without raising rents. So we're doing those financial studies in quite a bit of detail, and as I mentioned, Evergreen City Works is a leader in that process, and they're fantastic to work with. And we're hoping that the results provide some really clear next steps to say these are the real gaps and what policy changes might be considered and what business practices might be considered to do this.
That's great. Wonderful. Thank you, Graeme. And Gerben, maybe we'll just give you the last word. What if you had to put one word on the secret of Tower Renewal's success, what would it be?
Well, in general, I think that what I said before, I constantly try to plea for a more secure analysis of neighborhoods in which problems aren't trivialized and opportunities aren't being ignored. It's really, we should really look good at neighborhoods and don't choose for uniformity or urban average, but should focus on the function and the identity of a neighborhood and try to strengthen that identity, because I think the energy that's already in the neighborhoods, use that, and then the neighborhood will come up eventually.
Fantastic.
That's wonderful. That's perfect. I can't think of a better way to end today's session. I want to thank everybody. Thank you. Our time has run out. On behalf of all of our participants, Cities of Migration here at the Global Diversity Exchange, and our co-host, the Center for City Ecology, we'd like to thank Graeme Stewart from Toronto and Gerben Helleman from Rotterdam for today's wonderful session. I'd like everyone to imagine this excellent work being interpreted in your city, adapted by your organization, or maybe changing your neighborhood. And we'd certainly like to hear your stories and share more good practice with you. So please stay connected.